Abraham's Battle, Chapter 1. The last day of June, 1863. Charity waited for Abraham in the warm sweetness of the barn. At the sound of his footsteps, she pricked up her long ears. The door opened and morning light spilled in, hazing her coat with gold. Pigeons roosting in the rafters rose in a spiral toward the sun-filled roof. Abraham cocked his head at the flutter of wings. He was hearing rustlings that seemed to come from both inside and outside the barn. Up the hill, Mrs. Lightly stood at the kitchen window of the White House. Crisp gingham curtains framed cherry trees laden with fruit. She looked past the trees to where the roof of the barn was barely visible. "I don't see anybody," she said to Lady Smith, who was eating breakfast. "I know they're out there, but I just don't know where." Lady Smith looked up from where she was making roads and valleys in her bowl of porridge. "We probably won't even see any soldiers, Mother," she said soothingly, her pale hair lit by the early morning sun. Using the bowl of her spoon, Lady Smith made a lake in her porridge and waited while it filled with milk. She hated the stuff, and at 10 years old felt she was too old to have to eat it. Porridge was for babies. Besides, if she so much as touched a lump, it made her feel sick. But she didn't complain. She didn't want to upset her mother any more than she already was, and have her change her mind about letting her go to the orchard with Abraham and Charity. But Mrs. Lightly was fretting, running from one window to the next, looking for soldiers behind every tree. Lady Smith knew she was worried about the upcoming battle, which was bound to take place near their town of Gettysburg. Only nobody knew exactly where or when it would happen. The delicious smell of cherry tarts baking filled the kitchen, distracting Mrs. Lightly from her vigil at the window. Removing the hot pastries from the big wood stove, she placed them gingerly into a basket. "I used our last bit of sugar for these," she said to Lady Smith. "Take them for your picnic. Heaven knows when we'll get more." Lady Smith's boots made deep prints in the dew-laden grass as she hurried across the backyard, past the wash-house, the smoke-house, and down the hill to the paddock. At the gate she tried the latch, but it was rusty and refused to open. "Abraham will be gone before I get there," she fretted, giving the gate a swift kick. Then, putting the basket down, she climbed the fence, tumbling over in a froth of petticoats. By the time she sorted herself out again, Abraham was leading Charity from the barn. "It's not fair," she said as he helped her onto the mule's back. "Girls ought to be allowed to wear trousers. Then I could ride properly instead of side saddle, and I could climb fences better." "I hadn't noticed it slowed you down any," said Abraham mildly, in a voice that came from deep in his chest. The three of them ambled slowly down the hill from the Lightly's house. 100 years earlier, Lady Smith's great-grandfather had built this house on a gentle rise in a grove of trees way out in the woods. But over time the town had grown and was now only a few miles east. Still, the fine old trees protected the house from harsh winds in winter and offered shade in the long summers. Golden sunflowers turned heavy heads toward the sun. Crows flew inky black against the bright blue sky. Abraham was on his hands and knees, picking the crookneck squash nearly hidden under the broad leaves. When his basket was full, he stood up shakily, his old knees popping. "Wish I could just plant crops I could stand up to pick," he mused. "Okra would be good." He couldn't get the seeds, though. Seemed like folks up north didn't plant okra. Could be that it wouldn't grow so far up as Pennsylvania. He wasn't sure. But his stand of corn was as fine as any he'd grown at home, the leaves shiny green, the ears hassling like spun silk. As he walked to the rows that were shoulder high, he was grateful to the Lord for such a good crop. "Abraham!" called Lady Smith, her high voice as fluting as a little bird's. "Somebody's coming!" From the end of the corn row, Abraham looked down the slope toward the snake rail fence that separated the Lightly's property from the road. Lady Smith was perched on Charity's back, watching as a lone soldier came down the dusty road. It was a Johnny Reb in a faded uniform, his feet bare as a yard dog's. Pulling his hat down so that the brim shaded his eyes, Abraham started down the slope. "Lady Smith," he said when he neared the fence, "you and Charity ride on over to that patch of Yankee clover till I find out what this man wants." He felt uneasy, wary of this Confederate just showing up. Lady Smith hesitated. It seemed like grown-ups were always sending her off while they talked. It was just as silly as Abraham calling red clover Yankee, just because where he came from. Clover was white. "Go on now," Abraham said. "Your mama didn't leave you in my care to have something happen to you." Clucking softly to the mule, Lady Smith rode off. A moment later, while Charity cropped the tender flowers, she pretended to search for a four-leaf clover for good luck, but kept an eye on the two men. Although this was the third summer of the Civil War, the people in Gettysburg hadn't been much affected. The battles had been fought in other places. Up to now, Abraham hadn't had much truck with soldiers. Oh, he'd seen them off in the distance across the valley, but he sure hadn't anything to do with a Confederate. But now the war was drawing nearer. Earlier in the month, General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, had moved his troops north, and the Army of the Potomac under General George G. Meade was moving from Maryland in the south toward Lee's army. These armies, the Confederate and Union forces, would meet and fight at Gettysburg. The little town of 2,400 citizens was situated like the center of a web, with 9 roads leading into it. Those roads would soon be filled with long lines of soldiers in blue and gray, and the dust-spattering hooves of cavalry. But that wouldn't happen for a day yet. Soft dust puffed and settled on the soldier's feet when he stopped and looked over at Abraham. The two reached the fence at about the same time, Abraham on one side, the soldier on the other. Then the soldier nodded politely. "Mornin'," he said. "How y'all?" Abraham was startled by the first Southern accent he'd heard since arriving up north 4 years earlier. The softness of it fell on his ears like rain on a parched land. He thought it was a Georgia accent, but not of the low country where he came from. This was denser, with a rough twang. He nodded, but didn't say anything. After all, this boy was the enemy. He waited, the silence stretched out between them like a thin cord. The soldier looked over to where Charity was cropping sweet clover. "A good Molly mule's a purty thing," he said, "and you don't see a dark brown coat that often, least not in my part of the country. She changed color as she got older?" "Well, her full coat was pretty much that dark," said Abraham, speaking for the first time, pleased in spite of himself that Charity's fine qualities were appreciated. As if she knew they were talking about her, Charity stretched her neck and turned sideways. Her tail was braided and her forelock shaved to a neat fringe. "And where might your part of the country be?" Abraham asked him. "North Georgia," was the reply. "Up around Rabun Gap." Lady Smith couldn't stand being left out of the conversation, so she climbed down off Charity's back, then walked quietly over to the fence. She'd never seen a rebel soldier up close before, and didn't know what to expect. She looked at the tall, lanky soldier in the faded uniform as he stood squinting into the sun, his canvas haversack over one shoulder. Then, glancing down at his bare feet, she asked, "What happened to your shoes?" "Done walked 'em off," he said. "I come up all the way from the south to the north." "Why, you poor thing," said Lady Smith. "Does it hurt to march?" "My feet are tougher and lighter's knots," he replied, looking out toward the distant hills. He appeared to be thinking hard on something. Finally, he turned and stuck his hand over the fence to Abraham. "Name's Cooper," he said. "Private Lamar Cooper. Don't believe I caught your name." Abraham reflected that this was only the second time in his life that a white man had ever thought to shake his hand. He hesitated for a moment, but then, removing his hat, he held out his own hand. "Abraham Small, free man." "Pleased," said Lamar, drawing a long breath. "You from the South, too? How come you up here?" Nodding his head toward Ladysmith, Abraham replied, "I work for her daddy. He's in the army, too. The Union Army," he said pointedly. He spoke more carefully now, not sure how much to say to this soldier boy. When all was said and done, he was fighting for the other side, the wrong side. Still, Abraham couldn't see how the boy could do any harm to him here. "Before he joined the army, Mr. Lightly was a conductor for the Underground Railroad," Abraham went on. "It was him helped me get here from down near Savannah." It was Mr. Lightly who first shook my hand. "So you come up on the train?" Lamar asked, clearly confused. Abraham looked at him, at his blue eyes that were eager to please. "How old are you?" he asked. 16 last April." "The Underground Railroad ain't a railroad," Abraham explained, leaning on the fence. "It was a way for slaves to escape. It ain't there no more. The route closed down when the war started." He remembered a church, the First African Baptist in Savannah. It was the first stop on his railroad journey. They'd hidden him in a tiny space, dark, not big enough to sit up straight in, under the altar. They helped him at great risk since they too were colored, but Abraham saw no need to give Lamar too many details. Lamar looked at Abraham keenly, as if trying to read something in his face. "If you'll pardon me for saying so, you're the first slave I ever met." "Ex-slave," Abraham corrected him. And when Lamar nodded in acknowledgement, Abraham continued, "Folks helped us till we reached a safe place. Mine turned out to be here working for the Lightleys. Now I gets paid for my work. I got my own house, and I takes care of their place and the animals." "He takes care of me, too," said Ladysmith. "She's in my charge," Abraham said. Then, curious as to why Lamar was off by himself, he inquired, "You lost? Or scouting? 'Cause if you're scouting for food, I can tell you right now most of what's growing or has legs has been carted off. Rebs have chucked this land like an ear of corn. The cherry orchards are bare, and there ain't a pig to be found. Soldiers already took everything but the squeal." He glanced back at his own garden. So far nobody'd bothered it, but he knew it was not because of any tenderness of heart on either side. It was just that it was small and out of the way, and nobody noticed it. "I ain't scouting for food," said Lamar. "My orders are not to take anything we don't actually need. I'm with Lieutenant General James Longstreet," he added proudly, as if by giving his commander's name it explained something. And to him it did. It implied a decency, even in war. "We're running kind of short of things now, especially medicines. The ambulance corps is in a bad bind, so Doc Farrelly, one of the doctors in our regiment, asked me to scout for yarbs and such. He knows how to make medicines from stuff like blackberry, sweet gum, Solomon seal for wounds." Abraham nodded. "My mama knew about that kind of healing." "Any pennyroyal. We need lots of that," said Lamar. "You know where that grows round here?" "Y'all troubled by fleas?" Abraham said flatly. "That's a pure fact," Lamar admitted, "and lice. We got so many that I caught some with CS. That stands for Confederate States," he explained, "inscribed on their backs. In fact, we got a poem. Now I lay me down to sleep, while graybacks o'er my body creep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord their jaws to break." Abraham's laughter rang out, and when Lamar joined in, there was an easing between them, the way the air calms after a storm. "If my daddy gets them, he's gonna be hoppin' mad," Ladysmith announced, which made them laugh even harder. After thinking about it for a little while, Abraham asked Ladysmith, who knew every inch of the place, to lead the way to where purple-flowered pennyroyal dusted the slopes of the sunny meadow. After all, he thought, Herbs, or yarbs, as Lamar calls them, are for healing. Can't be any harm in that. It ain't like I'm helping him make bullets. We're just easing somebody's misery.